Well, folks, thanks for showing up for another night. I want to thank Helga Morrill. She was here last week. Great show, great turnout over at the Blue Millennium. Really, really good time. I really want to thank Helga. She's safely back up in Sedona. And today, folks, I want you to sit down and really get ready for a good show. Jim, why don't you introduce our guest? Just look right here.
All right, there we are. Hi. We have a really excellent opportunity to visit with a really good friend of mine this evening, Bob Dean. Bob is one of the more noted UFO researchers here in Tucson, in the United States, and probably even internationally. Bob's been a researcher in the field for about 40 years. He comes from a military background. He's was a retired command sergeant major from the Army. He was involved in military intelligence in Southeast Asia. He was affiliated with the SHAPE headquarters in NATO back in the early 60s. He had top secret security clearance. Bob had access to documents and information on UFOs that is truly astounding. And Bob has also been noted here locally over the last few years with a lawsuit that involved the Sheriff's Department, and that has made national headlines and so forth. And it turned out favorably for Bob in a legal sense. I think without any further ado, I'm just going to turn this over to Bob and say, welcome aboard. We're glad to have you here.
Yeah, glad to have you, Bob.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
We had Wendell
Pleasure to be
Stevens here with us not too long ago, and the two are our two favorite UFO researchers from here in Tucson. It's just really a pleasure, and it's an honor to have such noteworthy people on our program.
At my age, it's a pleasure to be anywhere. Thanks very much. I appreciate that.
Oh, you're welcome. Listen, Bob, golly, there's so much to cover with you. I think for starters, let's talk about how you got involved with UFO research, and what triggered it for you 40 years ago. And
well, I think it's important, Jim, if I may, to clarify something. As most of you probably know, I was a professional military man for most of my adult life. I always thought of myself as a rather hard-nosed skeptic. I was curious about the phenomenon. I was interested in what appeared to be going on in the world, but I didn't have a lot of information about it. And so I was a curious skeptic about it. But I was not involved in the New Age movement at all, and I was very hard to convince. And while I was in the military, I was trained as an intelligence analyst. And even though I was interested in the subject, I really was not convinced that there was any real truth to it until I was assigned to SHAPE headquarters in 1963. And SHAPE is the acronym for the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe. And I was assigned there in 1963 outside of Paris with a cosmic top secret clearance. And I had access to a study that was underway. And when I saw this thing and began to realize what it was all about, what it involved, and I realized for the first time in my life that the UFO matter was not a joke, it was not a fantasy, it was not science fiction, it was all real. And I must tell you that that exposure to that information and the study itself, which I read practically, I almost memorized it, literally changed my life.
now there were events that precipitated this study. Now this wasn't just a random study. The hierarchy in NATO just decided at some whim to get into UFOs. That there were events happening that precipitated this study.
You're correct. There was a whole series of events that triggered this thing initially. In the late 50s and early 60s, there were massive flyovers over Europe of what appeared to be large, metallic, circular objects flying in formation over Central Europe, coming out of the Soviet zone over the Warsaw Pact area, flying over France, Germany, over the English Channel, and they would always turn north over the English Channel and disappear off of our radar over the Norwegian Sea. Well, these objects, which were apparently and very obviously under intelligent control, caused a big stir. As you know, back in those years, we and the Soviets were facing each other across the Cold War line there with the divided Germany and all, and we were, both of us, armed to the teeth. And we found out that the Soviets for a long time thought that these objects were ours. And for a while, we thought that these objects belonged to the Soviets. And here we are with our fingers on the triggers and staring each other down. And Air Marshal Sir Thomas Pike, who was the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of SHAPE headquarters at that time, determined that we're going to have to find out what this is all about. This can't go on. We and the Soviets are going to end up shooting at each other someday, and we'll trigger World War III, and we can't let that happen. So the Air Marshal instituted this study in 1961. And General Lemnitzer, who was the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe at the time, who was the man I worked for, gave his approval. And they began a study that took 3 years to determine really what was going on here. And when that thing was published in 1964, and I had a chance to see it in its final form, I was stunned. Because, as I said, literally the information in that study changed my life. I stopped being just a curious skeptic, and I became aware that it was all true.
Okay, now this study was called the assessment, correct?
Yes. They started off by giving it a title called An Assessment, to assess what really was taking place. It had a subtitle, An Evaluation of a Possible Military Threat to Allied Forces in Europe. It became known as the assessment later on. And I found out recently, within the last year and a half, that it still exists, that it's still classified cosmic top secret, and it's still in the files.
Let me ask you something, Bob. You said it was published. How many people in the world at that time had access to it? You said that you saw it, you had a cosmic top secret. How many people actually had the cosmic top secret?
Well, at SHAPE headquarters, there were quite a few. I would say probably there were 300 or 400 people.
Was it a need-to-know type of a thing?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
I mean,
the document said that on the front.
Just because you had cosmic top secret didn't mean necessarily
that's
that
right.
you had access to it.
What's important to know is that they only published 15 copies.
That's what I was going to know.
Yeah, and there was very limited distribution on this thing, and there was a definite need to know. You just couldn't walk in and take it off the
Now,
shelf.
this was also sent to the U.S. I mean, you were in France at the time?
Well, what it was originally done when it was completed, and the general approved it, and Lemnitzer signed off on it, copy number 1 was given to the Secretary General of NATO, who was in downtown Paris at the time. Copy number 2 went to General Lemnitzer's desk, and copy number 3 came into the Operations Division, where I worked, in a place called SHOC, Supreme Headquarters Operations Center. That was the operational use copy, and that's how I got access to this thing. Copies were given to the French military commander, to the German military commander, to the Italian, to the Danish. All of the major military involvement at SHAPE headquarters got 1 copy.
Okay, so what was the conclusion of the assessment? UFOs are just totally bogus, or
No.
there was something really going on here?
As I said, it changed my life. Let me give you a little brief background on the conclusions. The study itself was approximately 1.5 inches thick, but it was supported by 6 to 8 inches of annexes. There was this much material available that backed it up and included studies, analysis, photographs. It was an amazing piece of work. I was impressed by it. I had been involved in work of this kind before, but this was one of the most complete, comprehensive studies I have ever seen. During the 3 years of the study, they had farmed bits and pieces of this out to some of the top people in the world. They had an annex on history, and I'm talking about ancient history. The history of the UFO phenomenon goes back a long, long time. There were annexes on atmospheric physics. There were annexes on psychological impact and studies. There was an annex on the theological implications of this study, which was one of the most interesting to me. The fact that the implications for the human race are mind-boggling. But when the thing finally came out, there were about 4 major conclusions. And I'll try to remember these if I can. The first one was that the human race and the planet Earth has been under an extensive, detailed survey and analysis by several extraterrestrial civilizations for a very long time. Now that is a mind grabber in itself. The conclusion reached this study that this has gone on for not only hundreds of years, but perhaps thousands of years. And remember I said several extraterrestrial, high-technology civilizations. The conclusion stated that there appeared to be some kind of a program or a process taking place. It was developing. We had studied it for a long time. We'd looked at it in great detail, and it was very apparent to the experts that something was happening here that was a planned, developing kind of process. Now, where that was going to lead and what the eventual outcome would be, they didn't know. But we're dealing with extremely advanced, high-technology extraterrestrial civilizations. There were two other major conclusions that are kind of interesting. One is that they concluded that there was no military threat involved, which was the primary reason the study was established in 1961.
It was a military study to begin with.
Exactly. Right? They concluded that there was no military threat involved because if there had been, it would have all been over. The degree of technology that was demonstrated was so far beyond anything we had that if there had been malevolence or hostility, it would have all been over. So they concluded there was not a military threat. And the other piece that intrigued me is that there were 4 separate groups involved in this survey. And the exciting part of it that I've never been able to walk away from, and the generals themselves were very upset about this, is that one of the 4 civilizations looked exactly like we do. That means that they could put on a coat and a tie or a dress and sweater and sit next to you in an airplane or in a restaurant, and you'll never know the difference.
Or even more disturbing, they could walk down the halls of the Pentagon.
Well, that's what disturbed the generals at SHAPE headquarters.
Right.
I want to break in here a minute.
Sure.
Bob, how many, you said they made the decision or they decided that it wasn't a threat. Who are they? Once the assessment was formed, did the generals or the presidents get together with a certain amount of NATO members, the highest form, and talk about this and say, what are we going to do? We've got to keep this under... Where was this decision made, or was it the United States that made this decision?
No. The conclusions of this particular study were made by the Supreme Allied Commanders themselves at SHAPE headquarters. And at the time, we had an American general in charge, General Lyman Lemnitzer. The British had an air marshal who was the deputy Supreme Allied Commander. Every major member of NATO at that time that was involved with military alliance had their top people involved. Once the conclusions were reached, once the study was completed, they sat down and analyzed what they had. And they made the conclusion that there was no military threat involved. And this was all real, and it was all serious, and something was happening. And then they made their report to the Secretary General of NATO.
Okay. Did that, like say for instance, Colin Powell was in charge of it, this is why I mean, did he have to go, could he, the Lemnitzer, could he make that decision right there without conferring to anybody else? He had that much power to hold it within that group? He did not have to go back and tell the President or anybody else in the United States?
General Lemnitzer, with the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, his primary responsibility was to the Secretary General of NATO. We had made those commitments when we began a part of it, became a part of it. So General Lemnitzer's primary avenue of reporting was through the Secretary General. Now, every major military headquarters had one of these copies, and it stirred up our military people, the Americans. Every major involvement there had its own little headquarters group. Now, the Americans knew all about this study, and I'm convinced that this information was shared with Washington. There's no doubt in my mind that the conclusions of the assessment were shared with Washington, with the Pentagon, with the Department of Defense, and all the rest of it.
But we need to make the distinction here that this was strictly a NATO document. This was not a CIA document.
That's correct.
It was not an NSA document, and we can assume that the NSA or the CIA has their own assessment, has their own investigation into this and so forth, comparable to the NATO study.
Well, we don't really assume that anymore. We know.
We know.
We know that as far back as 1947, 1949, our military people had reached almost the same identical conclusions. But that report was classified well above top secret. And if you know the history of it, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Hoyt Vandenberg, refused to let that information out.
Did the NATO assessment have extracts or anything from CIA documents?
Not that I remember.
There was no trade-off between...
It was basically an in-house study that they had done themselves, which made it so unique, because the study encompassed everything that the NATO military people were responsible for, from northern Norway clear down to the south, Greece and Turkey. The entire North Atlantic Treaty Organization military alliance was covered in this evaluation.
Bob, there's a couple of things we haven't covered here. You're doing a good job so far, but one, we don't know what a cosmic top secret clearance is. Can you explain that first?
Well, at the time, yeah, I'll try. At the time, cosmic top secret was a strictly NATO classification. It was the highest level of classification you could have in NATO. Now, at that time, the United States did not have a classification labeled cosmic. Now, I have been told, and I know for a fact, that we ourselves have now included the cosmic level on much of our own studies, on much of our own security clearances. For example, there is a cosmic level at executive level, which means that the president is involved in this. So you will find that if you really start digging into American security clearances, that we now have our own cosmic level. But at the time, this was the strictly NATO.
Okay. Now, the other thing that I think is important is to really establish how well equipped was NATO, or the people who did the assessment, how well prepared were they to be able to do this, to try to bring this document together so we can decide just, obviously it was very well done. But the question is...
Excellent piece of work, Roger. We were well prepared. Some of the top experts in their own special fields in Europe were brought into this thing. They'd gone to Tübingen University in Germany and got some of the world's foremost theologians to come up with an annex of their own about the impact of this kind of study, this kind of information. What are the implications for the human race? They had sociologists, psychologists, scientists, chemists, biologists. They had gone some of the top people in the world, both at Oxford, Cambridge, the Sorbonne, and some of the top universities in Germany and Italy. So some of the names that I have in some of my notes represent some of the top people in their specific fields in the world.
Now, in light of that, then there's two other questions that come up I think would be logical. One would deal with future events that might impact, that might be elicited from information that would be given or that would be acquired, and how that might impact us. And number two, and that would include earth changes, things of that nature, landings, etc. But there's another area there that, let's say that I'll hold off on that. Just let's deal with this one.
Okay. Specifically, what would you want me to tell?
Okay. In other words, did they come, as with some of our abductee or people who have in contact, that many of them have been shown things about earth changes and other things to take place on the planet. Was there some type of program or an elicitation of what our immediate future might be that they came to?
I don't remember that this was a major part of the study. It appeared to me from going through it several times that one of the major purposes of their contact, their flyovers, their landings, their abductions, was a gentle, subtle, kind of slow educational process to make us aware that, first of all, we're not alone, that secondly, we are probably a part of an infinite community of life out there, and that they appeared to be concerned enough with this initial contact to sort of try to gently bring us to the point that, hey, think about it, fellas. Because there was an abduction of a Danish farmer, for example. He was taken for a ride in a ship. Excited, the old man, had a ball. He came back babbling and excited and bubbling. There was an attempted abduction of an Italian Air Force sergeant. There were contacts taking place all over the NATO-shaped area of responsibility. And they were all benevolent, they were all benign, and every case the contacts were made by human beings. Never, in any of the reports that I had seen, was there any overt contact with the little gray guys. Every abduction, every invitation to come for a ride were with human beings. The Danish farmer was invited aboard. It was a dinner time. He was sitting down having dinner with his wife, and I heard this commotion going on in his pasture. The old man went out, and I visualized him with his napkin around his neck and his fork in his hand.
Yeah.
And this thing lands in his cow pasture, and two perfectly human beings get out of the ship, raise their hands, smile at him, and speak to him in perfect Danish, and invite him aboard. The old codger was delighted. He goes up the ramp, and the ship takes off, and they took him for about an hour. There was case after case after case of that, where they apparently were trying to tell people that there was no threat involved, there was no fear here, there was no hostility here. It seemed to me at the time that they were trying simply to let us know what was going on.
Bob, during this is going on in the early 60s?
These reports began back in the late 50s, but they weren't really put together in any kind of a form. They didn't start collecting the information until 1961.
Okay, now you got military collecting these things.
Yeah.
We're right in the middle of the Cold War.
Exactly.
I mean, we've got, within 2 years, we've got missiles coming to Cuba. And, I can remember being in, I think, the 6th grade or the 7th grade at the time. Everybody's talking about bomb shells. We're going through air raid signals and everything else. With this type of information that the Pentagon or military has, did they ever use it as a weapon? Russia must have had the same type of information. Could they have used it as a weapon saying, look at guys, look at what we know here, and we're working with these guys, and see what we've got, see, these guys are on our side. I mean, military seems to use everything as weaponry. They try to find things to better themselves and use it as a weapon. I think if I had that type of information, I would try to either blackmail countries or...
Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, the military being primarily...
That's my concept
Yeah.
of the military. Maybe it isn't.
Well, what was so interesting about this information is that we found, as we developed some of the facts, that the Russians knew almost as much about it as we did, because the same number of things were going on in the Soviet Union. Once we decided that, first of all, that this was not a Soviet military thing, and then we wanted them to understand that it was not ours, we established a line of communications with the Russians. Through the Warsaw Pact, the West Germans and the East Germans started to talk to each other. And that was the first attempt that I know of to establish an open, regular, hot line between their side and our side. And we found out that the West Germans had opened this through the Stasi to the East German military. Because even though the East Germans were communist and the West Germans were democratic, they were still Germans. They still felt a unity there, and they still talked to each other. They opened a direct line, and we learned from that direct line that the Russians were as concerned about all this as we were, and they had had landings, they had abductions, they had had some crashes and some retrievals. It began to come out in the early 60s that this was not simply happening to us. It was happening everywhere.
So there was a parity between
Exactly.
both world powers.
And
what was going on.
I don't think you could have used it for any kind of a military purpose like that, because we really didn't know what the hell was going on. Who are these people, and what are they really doing here, and what is their purpose and their goal? We didn't know that.
Well, if you could share with us a little bit, once this study was completed, what was the impact of this study on the generals in shape in NATO headquarters? Like Lemnitzer, for example, how did he react to this?
General Lemnitzer was a very strange man. He was a brilliant man, very quiet, very soft-spoken, never said very much. I saw him one day standing in the parking lot looking up. We had a number of cases where we had objects hovering over SHAPE headquarters. There was one case where there were 300 or 400 people standing out at the lunch hour watching an enormous cigar-shaped object hovering over SHAPE headquarters for about 30 minutes. I happened to see the old man at the same time, and he was looking up, and he looked around to see who else was seeing it. And my God, People were having lunch, the clubs were going, people were coming and going. Just at that hour where there were a lot of people out there, the old man looked around and saw everybody else looking up. He smiled, nodded, says, "It's one of them, all right."
Interesting. Now but there were other generals and so forth.
Well, there
high-ranking
was,
officers who didn't respond to well.
There was one case that I remember intimately, and it was kind of sad. The American air deputy at the time was an American four-star general by the name of Robert Lee. And he was an old friend of Curtis LeMay. They'd gone to school together. They were both cigar-chomping men. They were both strategic air command people, bomber pilots. Robert Lee was a tough, gruff, old pro. When he read the study, it had an impact upon him that was profound. His aide told me, he said that the old man was shaken. And I got to know the general relatively well because his kids and mine went to school together. The general lived in a villa, and I lived in a little house right down the street from his villa. But our kids rode the school bus together to the Paris American School. The general's aide said when he finished reading the report, he had his blouse open, he'd thrown his hat across the room, and he rubbed his head, and he said, "My God, do you know what this means?" This is a general who had such pride in having helped win World War II. We defeated the Germans, we defeated the Japanese. We had missiles, we had rockets, we had nuclear weapons. We had satellites.
Well, we had the biggest stick on the playground.
We had the biggest stick at the time. Russians had a pretty big one, but ours was bigger.
Ours was bigger, right.
The fact is that the general read the study and he said, "You know what this means? Everything we've got, everything we have ever done means nothing. The technology that was demonstrated there, the fact that there were several groups involved from somewhere else, that they had capabilities so far beyond anything we had, that it was a very humiliating kind of experience for the general. It was humbling. And here's this tough old bird who had great pride in his strategic air command and his bombers and his pilots and his fighters, to look at this kind of technology and said, "My God, everything we have is meaningless." And that was a very profound impact. I happened to see that firsthand, and it had a similar effect upon a number of other top people. It's a very sobering kind of reality here to come to terms with what this means. And then we find out that that, of course, is one of the major reasons why they've kept the lid on it all these years. Many of them do not feel that the average American, the average human being, is really psychologically ready for this kind of knowledge.
Now, was this brought up, did the assessment come to this conclusion also that we need to keep the security lid on this, and I mean really screwed down? In the 50s and the 60s, we had the Robertson panel, we had the Condon report, which were both our government saying that, you know, we have to keep a lid on this and we have to do whatever we can to ridicule and make this a subject that the public is, you know, stays away from. And we have to do whatever it takes to make that, you know, the end result. Was something similar, was a conclusion similar to this?
Once an intelligence agency or a top military headquarters makes a determination that a top classification, for whatever reason, has to be placed upon a subject, and it's that high a level, cosmic top secret, they make the determination this has got to be kept eyes only. There's a limited distribution on this sort of thing, and only very few people really should ever have access to this. And there's another point I wish to make, if I may, is that I want people to understand something. I have not lightly begun to violate my security oath in this matter. I was a loyal Cold Warrior for all of those years. I believed in security. I believed in military classifications. I believe in my country and my Constitution. And I kept that secret for a very long time. And I'm still keeping secrets that I have never divulged, that I have had access to, information that I know about. But this matter with the UFOs is so important in my view that I am purposely taking a risk here to divulge what little I know about it in hopes that other people who've had similar assignments, who've seen similar bits and pieces of information, will agree with me and come out and start to talk about it.
This is really a duty, Bob. It's from a citizen standpoint. It's really, what you're doing is really fulfilling a civic and citizen's duty to his fellow citizens, and it's not a matter of breaking an oath. In other words, what they're doing, quite frankly, it's the citizen's responsibility to make those decisions.
I agree with you, Roger.
Military.
Yeah,
So,
that's exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing.
I know.
I feel that it's not only the American voter's right to know, because he's paying the bills,
Yes.
but he has a need to know, because the implications of the reality of what we're talking about here is earth-shaking and mind-boggling. And one of the things I wish to stress here in this discussion is that I'm going to be talking about things tomorrow night
Yes.
that I think are matters of great importance to people. And if I'm still walking around tomorrow night and still healthy, I'm going to share some information that I've never shared before.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of stuff tomorrow night. And also, you have, isn't there something going on tomorrow at the library?
Yeah, it's a MUFON meeting.
There's a MUFON meeting, which I am chair of tomorrow.
This is a quarterly.
It's a quarterly MUFON meeting, Mutual UFO Network. And that's in the main library at one of the downstairs meeting rooms from 1 to 4.
And that's free, there's no charge.
And that's free, there's no
Free to the
charge.
public,
Matter of
right.
fact, we even serve coffee and sweet rolls.
One thing I think we need to stress is that a lot of people think, well, it's just for MUFON members, and that's not true.
It's open to the public.
To the
Yeah.
entire public.
As a matter of fact, 3/4 of the people who attend are not MUFON members.
Yeah, that's fine. And I'm just going to cut in real quick on this. Can you pick this up, Mark? This is going to be held tomorrow evening
7 o'clock at the Holodome.
at the Holodome, right? And
Holiday
that's on
Inn.
the Holiday Inn off of Palo Verde over there by
That's
the
correct,
by the swap meet. And what time is it?
7 to 10 o'clock.
7. And there is a charge.
charge.
Yeah.
So if you, Bob isn't telling all tonight, so please, if you really want to hear some interesting stuff and being able to ask Bob some questions yourself, be sure to contact us here at UFOAZ, or well, you're not going to have much time to contact us. Just be out there at the Holodome. Or if you need more information, come down to the main library and ask Bob there.
Exactly.
Okay, now I'm going to jump in here.
No
real quick.
fair.
No, you can have it after I do. We had Jerry Schultz on a program a couple weeks ago.
Right.
And he mentioned you and talked about the SHAPE report and some of the things that you said. And he said that you had named that there were 4 primary aliens that the SHAPE had named or had come in contact. Is that correct? He said one that looked like us and that could walk in. We mentioned that earlier. What were the other 3? Did they look like us? Are they the same type of thing that John Lear is talking about that's working hand in hand with the government, or do you know anything about it?
The study did not get into great detail because it had to make its conclusions based upon the specific evidence it had. But it concluded that out of the 4, one group were typically human, perfect humans, just like us. You'd never know the difference. One group was described as being very much like some of the little grays we've seen. During the crash in northern Germany, when they retrieved 12 small bodies from a 30-meter disk that crashed in northern Germany, all of the 12 little bodies were little gray fellows. But the conclusions that the NATO study reached were very much like the conclusions that our own Defense Department people had reached, is that the little gray guys may not be entities in their own right. They appeared to be clones of some kind.
Like a plant life?
Well, they were all identical, absolutely identical. When they were doing the autopsies on these little guys, I mean, they couldn't find any differences in them.
More like biological
They're like
robots
laboratory
or,
products.
Yeah,
or
They're-
androids.
clone off a plant.
that they're biological androids, that they are all clone products. And there have been other researchers who've come to that same conclusion.
That way they'd be disposable in a sense.
Well, you write them off.
Yeah, right.
When we had the retrieval at Kingman some years ago, and they took the living one and the other bodies up to Nellis, it worried the Air Force for a long time because they kept thinking that they were going to come back for their guys.
Right.
Well, they weren't coming back. They simply wrote them off. And we kept one of them alive up there for a couple of years. Nobody came back for him.
Well, was that particular crash, was that the same one that took place in Spitsbergen?
No.
That's not.
No, another separate entirely.
And this crash was what year around?
This was in the Baltic area, northern Germany, about 1961.
So
The year of the study, the year that the study began.
Okay.
A
So were
30-meter disc crashed in northern Germany, about a half a mile from the Baltic Sea. And the disc was not destroyed.
Right.
The British Army, an engineer battalion, the British Army was able to take it apart in pieces like wedges cut from a pie,
Right.
and they put those pieces on lowboys and hauled them away.
So they definitely acquired technology.
Oh, they got technology. Of course, they got a lot of technology they didn't know what to do with.
Not getting
How do you back engineer something like that could be 1,000 years ahead of you?
Sure.
It's not easy.
Not getting away from his question, because I don't want to lose track of that. We do want to identify the other groups, but what about the Spitsbergen crash? What was aboard that one?
Grace.
Grays also. Okay, fine.
The
Well-
shape study did touch upon that it appeared interesting and unusual that in the crashes, and there were several, that in every case, the retrievals involved little gray bodies. Never in the study that I can remember even touching upon did they ever mention that human beings crashed.
How convenient.
Okay. Well, now we've kind of
Two types.
two types, the grays and the humans, or human-looking.
Well,
Two down, two to go.
I'll share with
Yeah,
you what
go.
little I know here. I'm not going to hold forth as an expert, because I'm not, and I'll be the first to admit that to
Well,
you.
I'm trying to get to this.
One group appeared to have a reptilian
That's where I was
capability.
going with it.
Now, let me explain something. The study, the assessment, stated that they were all humanoid. Now, they all had 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, apparently 2 ears, a mouth of some kind, although there were variations. But they were all humanoid. There was one group that appeared to be reptilian, in that the pupils of their eyes were vertical, and their skin appeared to have
Scaly.
a scaly kind of effect. Now,
Color?
these people had been seen, but they were not bodies in crashes. They were people who had been seen and photographed. Now, the other group were humanoids, but they were very tall, very large. And I don't know, they don't have any hair. They sometimes run as much as 8 feet tall. And they have round faces, no hair at all. But they're humanoids. Now, they couldn't sit next to you on an airplane without you wondering who the hell that was.
Unless he had a basketball in his lap.
But that was the 4 separate groups. The large humanoids with no hair, the little gray fellows with the large heads, the reptilian group, which are about human size, 5.5 feet, 6 feet sometimes. And these have been seen all over this country by
What
law
about skin
enforcement
color, texture, whatever? Do they look that much like us or different from us? What do you
With
know
the
about them?
reptilians?
Yeah.
Well, they look different enough from us that you wouldn't be able to look at one without being shocked by it.
Have you ever noticed when we had Mr. John Lear on the show about 2 months ago, and Roger interviewed him quite extensively in Phoenix, and he brought up a point. He said that the government is working with a series of different aliens, and he about mentioned the same types that you've mentioned, other than there was one group that was so, I don't want to say ugly but so terrible looking that people had to be, that worked with these entities had to be they had to be, what did he say?
You had to be very carefully conditioned to
They had to
accept
show
it.
them for a couple of days and then pull them back, and then 3 more days, and then back and forth. Did you ever hear of that or run across anything? Certainly it's not out of the realm, but it's...
I have, as I've mentioned earlier, spent the last 30 years of my life digging deeply into this subject. And most of the information that I feel that I've learned, come up with, has been the result of studies I've made since I retired. I still have friends in low places. I still have a couple of my old cronies who are still working for an organization at Langley, Virginia. and another one at Fort Meade. And these guys chair with me once in a while. They let me know a little bit off the cuff, so to speak. I'm told that there is now well over a dozen separate groups out there, and that there is indeed a program underway to condition people to not only deal with facing these people, accepting them, but just the idea that we're not alone. And you look around the country and you look at some of the ads that appear in the magazines and some of the ads that are on television. The little beer ad, was it the Miller beer ad of the little Grays dancing with beer cans?
Well, yeah, but not only that. Have you seen that Deep Star 9?
No,
It's that offshoot of
I'm aware of
okay.
the scenario.
But what they really tried to do more than what I've been noticing on that is they show about 15 or 20 during the course of the show, different alien type. I mean, some grotesque. I'm sure they probably think I was grotesque too. But I mean, looking so.
Agreed.
Oh, Roger, I was going to save that for you later. But maybe that is a form of conditioning, because all of a sudden that's come in, and you see all of these types, and if you're watching it on something that isn't offensive, maybe it's a way of just bringing you gradually.
If you can be educated in a non-threatening kind of way,
Sure.
I'm convinced that our government, at some level, is indeed doing that. Now, my personal view is they're not doing enough of it fast enough. I think that people need to be told some basic facts, and I think that can be done. I think our government could come out and say to people, look, we've known for some time that we're not alone, that we're dealing with extraterrestrial intelligence. And they apparently are not threatening. And we just want you to know that. And we're going to let you know information, bits and pieces as it develops, but it's not something to get all hysterical about.
The fact that they're already dealing with them
Yeah.
at some of the facilities would be more reasonable to say that we can tell you firsthand that they're friendly.
That we've had an ongoing relationship
Yes.
with at least one or two groups for some time.
That's right. And there's a lot of scuttlebutt going back and forth on the computer. With regard to what you're saying, Ted, really in all honesty, the people really debate this stuff and the value of what's being said, the merits of what's being discussed on these programs, and they bat this stuff back and forth at some depth. And we're talking about on some of the more serious...
Much of it is on a
networks.
subliminal level. That's interesting to me.
That's true,
because
too.
these magazine ads, you'll pick one up, and there was one that was advertising discs, CDs, and I saw these 3 or 4 little golden discs flying through a neighborhood down the street, and I can't remember exactly what the lead line was on, but this is a subtle kind of way to tell people. It makes an imprint at a deep subconscious level.
One of the areas that I wanted to go into, and I didn't go, you set it up very nicely after I asked the question, but then I didn't get a chance to follow quickly. The Fatima prophecy that the Pope supposedly has in access, were they able to access and look at that?
Well, Roger, that's one of the reasons why this is such a sensitive area. It became quite apparent, and this annex in the assessment touched upon that, the religious implications, the shock, what it's going to do to organized churches on this planet. Now, I must tell you, and this is one of the things that I'm very strongly working with, right? I'm very deeply concerned about this, the impact on people. The true knowledge of what this is all about, what's been going on for a very long time, this intimate interrelationship we've been having with extraterrestrial intelligence for God knows how many thousands of years, is going to have an impact on organized religion
Yes, it will.
on this planet. And I'm not talking about just Christianity. I'm talking about every major religion on the planet. And that's the thing, that's one of the major things that our government and all of the leaders of the world are worried about. What is it going to mean to people if you find out that the basis for almost every one of our major theological philosophies has come from somewhere else? Just think about it.
Yes, Ted, go ahead.
During the report, when you said that it was brought to all the major heads of NATO during this period of time, did they ever take the final report and go up to the Pope Do you know this? Or
He was
ask
not on the
Paul?
distribution list.
I mean,
All
what was he brought in?
They have a need to know.
Well,
I need to know.
I'll tell you something
I'm worried about this type of a thing.
that I've concluded myself after many years of study, is that the Vatican knows a lot more about what's been going on than you would imagine.
I'm sure they have their own CIA.
I've discussed UFOs with Jesuits, and they're among some of the most well-educated people in the church.
Yes.
And I've talked intimately with Jesuits about this subject and the religious implications. And many of them agree with me that we know about it, that it's real. We've known about it for a very long time. And there even are people in the church who realize that what happened at Fatima and Garabandal and many of the other
Right.
so-called holy religious experiences were UFO experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the implications here are literally mind-boggling, earth-shaking. I mean, this is one of the major points that I've been trying to make over the years, and I'm going to stress it tomorrow night. You go beyond the hardware,
Mm-hmm.
the reality of that. You go beyond the fact that there are extraterrestrial intelligences here. We know they're here. They've been coming. We got evidence. It's overwhelming.
That's right.
But the subject that intrigues me the most, that I'm really trying to stress the most, is the spiritual impact. What it means to the human race. The fact that we are not alone. The fact that we are not threatened, that there is no major threat here. That we're going to come to a point very soon, and I'm saying sooner than most people realize,
Right.
where this is all going to come out. And the spiritual implications, in my view, are 99% of it.
And that's been probably the most important thing, because it's been stressed by so many of these different cultures, especially the ones that look like us, that have had direct contact, and they've talked about this all over the world, that they have stressed the spirituality, the development of the spirituality of the consciousness of the individual.
Every major religion on this planet, Roger, if you go back far enough and you study the details of how they began, tell essentially the same story. Whether it's in Buddhism, whether it's in Judaism, whether it's Hindu or Christian, it doesn't matter. You go back to the beginnings, the same essential story is told by every one of the great religious founders of those religions. Jesus of Nazareth said essentially the same thing that Krishna said in India.
Right.
They almost were reading from the same text. As a matter of fact, if you compare some of the works in the Bhagavad Gita, it's almost word for word from some of the statements that the carpenter from Nazareth gave at the Sermon on the Mount. Now, this is no accident, and this is no coincidence. We're dealing with some very important information here, and it's time that we pay attention and grow up and address this.
Go ahead, Jim. I'll let you have room.
Okay, just to digress into just a little bit different area here. Getting back to the assessment and its impact on the military officials and so forth. As I understand the military, when it is confronted with a technology like this, it's not inclined, to throw in the towel, so to speak, and say, well, you've topped us, there's nothing more we can do. We have seen proliferation of black budgets, black programs, secret development projects. We've seen films of SDS-48. We see what appears to be Star Wars weapons testing. We hear about Site 51 in Nevada and the Bob Lazar scenario. We hear about alien exchange with military and so forth. Is the military, and through your understanding and your contacts through military intelligence and so forth, are we trying to get on par with this kind of technology so we're not, bringing up the rear, so to speak? I mean, understanding the military mindset, it would seem to me that it would be top priority to get on par with this kind of technology.
Well, yes, you're right, and it is. And one of the reasons why the cover-up was so tight initially was not just the sociological and psychological impact upon civilization, The military mind being paranoid, basically, not being humble people, and I speak from experience, I spent most of my adult life in there. Yes, they look at things as a threat. They say, well, we've got to get a handle on this technology. We need to know this ourselves. And that's still going on. There are military people involved in these studies and this research who want to know as much as some of our visitors know.
So this is another component for the
It's another
need for
component.
public secrecy
Exactly.
across the board.
Jim, if the American people knew what we have done ourselves in the last 25, 30 years, they wouldn't believe it. Our
Right,
own technology has made strides that are just beyond Star Trek. I mean, there's stuff you're seeing on these programs, these science fiction programs, that we literally are able to do.
Well, I know we spoke with John Lear, and John Lear's shared with us that the Star Wars project that our government is deeply involved with was never intended for as anti-missile weaponry against the Soviets. That there's a completely different intention
It was indeed.
for the Star Wars project, and that and he said that Star Wars was complete and in place as of 1984.
We've got technology that's workable right now. To give you an example, you may have heard this from other sources. We worked out problems of fusion over 7 years ago. We conducted a sustained fusion reaction at Los Alamos over 7 years ago. Now, the American taxpayer who paid for that research has never been told that. You realize what a hot potato fusion is, what it's going to do to the oil companies and the automobile industries. To give you another example, we've had a workable particle beam weapon for 15 years. And our military guys, many of the people I've talked to, have seen it work. A workable particle beam weapon. Now that's part of the Star Wars thing. That can bring a satellite down just like that. It can bring a spaceship down. It can bring anything in orbit down. But it's not that good on some of the technology that still exists out there.
We only have about 6 minutes left in the
Okay.
program, but I want to go into something too. I want a couple things. You just last year, 6 months ago, you went to Germany, and during that period of time, did you happen to check on any of your old buddies that maybe were living in the NATO or in Germany or Italy, and see if anybody else was willing to? You said when it was published there was 40 people that knew about the assessment. Could you ever find any of them and have them come out and say the same thing with you? Or have they said it in Europe and we haven't heard about it?
Well, let me tell you this, that there are things being said in Europe in the newspapers and on the press that never get said over here. And this is something embarrassing to me, because when you find out that some of the European press is more open than our own, that's a little hard to deal with.
Mexico, too.
Yeah, I
Right
know,
across
I
the
know.
border.
The Germans, the Italians, the French, the British talk about things more openly than we do. To give you one tiny example is that famous incident where the entire Soviet general staff, the air defense staff, had a big major UFO hovering over their headquarters for over an hour. 300 or 400 people watched that. The generals, the Soviet marshals, had MiGs flying above it, under it, around it. It was in the major newspapers all over Europe. Not one bit of that got into the American press. Not one peep.
Tell the viewing public when this was.
Well, this was last summer.
Yeah. Okay.
And you think that we don't have a controlled press in this country? That really frosts me, I must be honest with you. I'm trying not to use some of my old military terms here, but that really bothers me a lot. I learned things in Europe that I hadn't known before. There were people, I've been putting together a network of experts, researchers, people that I trust over the years. And we're sharing information with each other now. And we're all prepared to come together and help the government, if it really wants to be helped, get some of this information out in a very gentle, controlled, non-threatening way.
Well, we're trying to do that here at UFOAZ.
I know,
That's what
I
we're all
know.
about.
I'm going to jump in before the time runs out. You also just came back, and you will briefly, because I think you'll go over this tomorrow evening, but you just came back from Washington, D.C. also. Why did you go, and what was the outcome? Did you meet some people that are interested in what you're doing and what's going on? Can you say a little bit about that?
Just a little, yeah. We've all been fascinated by what this so-called synchronicity going on in the world, about the fact that things happen in strange ways. Right. I spent a week with Tim Good in London, who's a researcher and a writer that I respect. He's written one of the finest
Right.
books I've ever read,
Above Top Secret. Right.
And Tim gave me a connection, a number and a phone, a name and a phone number with an American, highly placed American in Washington, D.C. And so I made the trip to Washington last month and had one of the most interesting meetings I've ever had on this subject with a person who is highly placed in the United States Senate, who is interested in getting a handle on the black budget expenses in this country. And he says that the senators on the Appropriations Committee know that there are abuses, that we're spending $50 billion a year of money that is totally uncontrolled by people who are totally unaccountable to Congress, that nobody has any oversight on this matter, and the Senate Appropriations Committee is going to try to lift the lid on this thing. And he mentioned Site 51, Groom Lake. He mentioned the Department of Energy. He mentioned EG&G. He mentioned the, what's the security people? Wackenhut International. He mentioned them all.
Yeah, he didn't mention UFOAZ.
And this connection, this
Wait till he
individual,
finds out.
and I kind of hit it off. We trusted each other. We seemed to be able to talk with each other. I've offered my assistance to him, and he's offered his assistance to me. And we're going to try to work together on this thing. And I expect him to show up out here probably in the next week or 10 days.
One more, and then you guys can jump in with the time that we have. There are UFOAZs being shown in 7 different states now in different times, and there are many people that are copying this show, and we're getting word from all over the United States and Puerto Rico and some areas that people are constantly watching our show and wanting more about it. Is there, you as a retired from the military, can you tell the people that some of the other retirees that are out there, is there anything that you could tell them or say to them that you know, you and I talked to a gentleman just the other day about something like this, and is there something that you could say?
Well,
is there anything you can't say? Or?
I'll tell you this. It's a personal matter.
Sure.
And I'm not urging anyone to take chances.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want people to do anything that would be threatening to their retirement, if they're still active, and many of them still are. I don't want them to threaten their career or their families. But I'm convinced that togetherness, number of us working together, we're going to be safer. And the more professional retirees, the people who are still active, and you know, we got 11 astronauts who are now willing to speak about this matter.
That's what you're saying.
All they ask is that they are protected and that they're not charged and they don't lose their careers and their pensions. 11 American astronauts. We have 4 cosmonauts, Soviet cosmonauts, who are willing to talk, including a 3-star general. So I would say to the guys out there, the retirees, come out and we'll do it together. Let's get together. Let's share the information together. Let's go public together. And I think in that kind of grouping, there's safety and security. If you try to do it all by yourself, there is a risk. But you come out, I don't believe, and I'm taking a chance on this one, I don't believe the government is willing to go to court and have us and them plastered across all of the headlines to take me as an individual to task for violating my security oath. If I've got 15 and 20 other guys out there who are willing to do the same thing, they can't sue us all. They can't find jails for all of us. My God, man, we're talking about thousands of people.
Maybe you can answer the question tomorrow at the program. Mm-hmm. But we're at a point where we recognize the spirituality and awareness of these individuals and very benevolent in their behavior. But why the government with the negative aspects? And so perhaps you can identify or...
Just answer this after a minute. We're about ready to close. Bob will answer that. Please come over to the library tomorrow at 1 o'clock, 1 to 4, main library, and come and see Bob at the Holodome.
Right.
From what time? 7 o'clock?
7 to 10.
7 to 10. Okay, go ahead, and if you would, answer the question.
What was the question again?
The question is the comparisons between the spirituality aspects and our seemingly